the morning I caught Karen rolling my rain barrels down the hill. I didn't know whether to laugh or explode. Thaw's barrels weren't just any rain collectors. They'd been sitting under the pine trees all summer, gathering the kind of acidicron off that would corrode anything it touched. By the time she discovered what she'd taken, her fancy water tanks were already destroyed. And trust me, this was just the beginning of a battle she would regret starting. Let us know where you're watching from today. And if you're new here, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to join our growing community. I've always believed a man's true peace lies where the noise of the world can't reach him. For me, that place is a weathered wooden cabin sitting on 3 acres of penny-covered hillside in the northern Rockies. The scent of pine needles and damp earth greets me each morning as I step onto my porch with a steaming mug of coffee. From up here, I can see a ribbon of dirt road winding through the valley. And on clear days, the snow-capped peaks gleam like silver against the blue sky. I built this cabin with my own 2 hands 15 years ago. Every plank, every nail, every corner of the place carries a memory. There's a deep satisfaction in knowing that no contractor or fancy company came in to design my life for me. I've kept it simple. There's no cable, no constant hum of traffic, none anymore peeking through curtains every 5 minutes at least. That's how it used to be. Before Karen came along, Minira's neighbor was a mile away. And even then, we barely exchanged a wave. One of the best things I ever did was set up a rainwater collection system. I have a series of barrels lined up under the edge of my roof and a couple out near the pine grove. Some folks don't get it, but I've always liked using what nature gives me. The barrels fill up with clean mountain rain, and I use that water for cleaning, gardening, and sometimes even minor workshop tasks. Over the years, I learned that some of the runoff from pine needles can be slightly acidic. It's perfect for stripping rust from tools or cleaning stubborn stains off metal. It's not just about being practical. It's about being independent. I don't rely on some overpriced water delivery service or the grid. Out here, you learn to take care of yourself. I remember my dad telling me once, a man who can't make his own fire or collect his own water doesn't own his life. He's renting it. I've lived by that for a long time. This cabin was a sanctuary. I'd wake up to the sound of wind rushing through the trees and the chatter of squirrels fighting over pine cones. Afternoons were for chopping wood, fixing fences, or working on small projects in my workshop. I'd end the day with a quiet walk along the dirt path down to the creek, feeling the cool breeze roll off the water. Life was good, uncomplicated, steady, and mine. But the world has a way of sending trouble where it's least welcome. About 2 years ago, the land just beyond my southern fence line got sold off. The new owner was a woman named Karen, though. Trust me, the name isn't the worst thing about her. Shouldn't just move in. And she brought her whole sense of suburban control with her. Within a month of her arrival, she owed a clipboard in hand, marching up and down the road like she was running the place. She claimed she was sorry establishing the HOA, something that had been long dead out here. I laughed when I heard it, thinking there was no way anyone would take her seriously. But Karen was the kind of person who thrived on control. She sent letters, real printed letters, telling me my cabin porch was not up to code. She complained about my woodpile looking unsightly and even told me the barrels under my trees were illegal water containers. Illegal. I built this place on private land with no HOA rule stouching me. At least that's what I thought. At first, I ignored her. I figured, like most busybodies, she'd run out of steam when no one fed her power trip. But Karen didn't slow down. If anything, she escalated. I'd catch her standing at my fence line with her phone out, snapping pictures of my property like some kind of self-appointed insper. One morning, as I sipped my coffee, I saw her across the field eyeing my rain barrels with that sharp, judgmental look. I didn't think much of it until the day I discovered she'd crossed the line. But that, as they say, is a story for the next part. Karen wasn't just a neighbor. She was a storm wrapped up in a pastel cardigan, ready to unleash chaos on anything that didn't fit her idea of order. The woman had a permanent scowl, as if the world was a messy room, and she was the only one holding the mop. From the day she moved in, I noticed her walking around with that stiff posture, chin tilted up like she was inspecting the land for flaws. She had a brand new SUV that she parked at perfect angles, like she was in some kind of showroom. Her yard, in contrasto the rugged beauty of the mountain landscape, looked like it belonged in a suburban catalog trimmed bushes, little white decorative stones, and a tiny HOA rules keep a safe sign stuck right in the middle. I'll admit it made me laugh the first time I saw it. Out here, nobody cared about HOA rules. We lived by nature's rules. If it snows, you shovel. If it rains, you stay dry. But Karen wasn't the kind to mind her own business. No, she had to be the sheriff, the judge, and the HOA president, all rolled into one. She started with little suggestions, slipping notes under my gate like some passive-aggressive idinar. Your woodpile is stacked too close to the property line. Rain barrels attract mosquitoes. You should remove them. Your fence is leaning. It's not safe. I ignored most of it. I'd seen enough these types before. The more you engage, the more they thrive. But Karen was relentless. I caught her one afternoon, leaning over my fence, taking photos of my rain barrels with her phone. "What are you doing on my property line?" I called out. I was standing on my porch with a rag in my hand. Having just finished oiling some tools, she jumped a little, clearly not expecting me to see her. Then she straightened up and crossed her arms like she was in the right. "I'm documenting potential code violations," she said, her voice sharp but shaking slightly. "Code violations." I laughed. "Lady, this is private land. You don't get to make up rules here." Her eyes narrowed. "Actually, this whole area falls under an HOA agreement that was never dissolved. I'm just enforcing it for everyone's good." I wanted to ask her what everyone meant, since she was the only neighbor within a mile, but I bit me tongue. I knew her type. They twisted every word you said. Instead, I just shook my head and went back to my tools. A week later, I found a printed letter taped to my gate. It had her name, HOA Karen, typed underneath. She'd written a list of demands about my barrels, my porch, even the way me firewood was stacked. She ended it with a line that made me grin. "Failure to comply will result in HOA action." I tore it down and tossed it in the wood stove. If she thought I'd bodo her mad-up rules, she was in for a shock. But Karen didn't take my silence well. The next thing I knew, she was telling the delivery guy that I was hoarding illegal water. She cornered me at the mailbox one morning, waving a pamphlet she'd printed about mosquito-borne diseases and how my rain barrels were apparently a public health hazard. I told her point blank, "Karen, those barrels are staying. You don't like it? Don't look at them." Her face turned bright red, but she didn't say another word. She just stormed off like a kid who didn't get her way. I should have known that silence meant trouble was brewing. The breaking point came one weekend after a heavy rainstorm. I'd been inside, sanding down an old table I was refinishing. When I stepped outside to grab some water from the barrels, I noticed something odd. 3 of them were gone. At first, I thought maybe the wind had knocked them over and rolled them down the hill, but the ground was. And I could see the drag marks leading straight toward Karen's property. My heart sank. Then anger flared like a match. She didn't just snoop or nag. She stole. I walked to the fence line, and sure enough, there they were. My barrels lined up neatly behind her house, hooked into her fancy tank system like they belonged to her. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just an annoying neighbor situation. Karen had crossed the line, and I wasn't about to let her get away with it. I can still feel my jaw tightening when I remember that morning. The sun had barely cleared the ridge, and the dew was still glistening on the pine needles when I spotted those drag marks. They cut across the soft earth like scars, leading straight from my collection area down toward Karen's place. The audacity of that woman. It was like she believed Thuhole Mountain was her personal playground. I walked over to her property line, and sure enough, there were my barrels, positioned neatly beside her massive silver tanks. She'd hooked them up like they were hers all along. I stood there for a moment, fists clenched, trying to decide if I should storm in or play it cool. But before I could act, Karen appeared, dressed in a pastel jogging suit and holding a water hose like she was queen of the mountain. "What do you think you're doing with my barrels?" I called out, my voice low but sharp. She didn't even blink. "These were improperly placed on shared property," she said as if she were reciting a law book. I've decided to repurpose them for the community. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because I couldn't believe she had the nerve. Shared property, lady. This isn't a suburban cul-de-sac. That's my land, and those are my barrels. Put them back. She smirked, tilting her head like I was the one being unreasonable. If you're that desperate for water, you can collect it right way. Your system was unsightly and potentially hazardous. I took a step closer to the fence, my voice turning cold. You have until sundown to return them, Karen, or I'll be making a call you won't like. Her eyes flashed with that mix of arrogance and spite that only people like her seem to have. Oh, please call whoever you want. You'll find I'm not the one breaking the law here. And with that, she turned her back on me, walking toward her porch like the conversation was over. I stood there breathing hard, my mind racing. She had no idea what's just done. Those barrels weren't filled with fresh mountain spring water. They were full of rainwater that had been running off pine bark and old metal roofs, a mixture that made the water highly acidic. I used that water, tossed rip rust off tools, and cleaned corroded iron parts. It wasn't meant for drinking or irrigation. At first, I thought I'd mark right over and warn her, maybe even dump the barrels myself before she did something foolish. But the more I thought about it, the angrier I got. Karen had barged into my life, made up her own rules, and now she'd stolen from me. Maybe a little reality check would do her good. So, I waited. The next day, I was sitting on my porch sharpening a hatchet when I heard a scream. It wasn't just a startled yelp. It was the kind of shriek that told you something had gone terribly wrong. You looked up and saw Karen flailing her arms near her tanks. From where I sat, I could see streaks of brownish water spilling out from the seams of her silver containers. The acid rainwater had started eating into the metal, corroding it from the inside. I walked over slowly, my hatchet still in hand. Problem, Karen? I called out, trying to keep my tone neutral. She spun around, her face pale and furious. What did you do to this water? It's ruined my entire tank system. The metal is corroding. I leaned against the fence, pretending to think. Funny thing about rainwater, I said. Depends on where you collect it. Those barrels weren't for drinking water? Karen, I use that runoff to strip rust. It's pretty acidic. Her jaw dropped. You mean you let me take contaminated water? I raised an eyebrow. Contaminated? No. It's just not something you pour into a brand new steel tank, unless you want holes in it. But hey, you did say you were She stared at me speechless, her face a mix of embarrassment and rage. It earned and walked back to my porch, hiding the grin that was tugging at my lips. This was only the beginning. Karen might have thought she'd won by taking my barrels. What she didn't realize was that she'd just started a war and I wasn't planning on losing. After Karen's tank started leaking like a sieve, I knew she'd be back to blame me for her ignorance. And sure enough, later that afternoon, I saw her stomping across Thedert Path toward my fence. Her jogging shoes caked with mud and her face twisted like she'd just bitten into Alamon. You need to pay for this, she shouted, before I could even put my coffee cup down. Your disgusting water destroyed my tanks. Do you know how much those cost? I leaned against the porch post, calm as ever. Sounds like you have a storage problem. Not me. This is sabotage, she cried. You deliberately set me up. Set you up. I chuckled. Karen, you stole my barrels. I didn't pour anything into your tanks. What happened to your fancy setup is just basic chemistry. She blinked like didn't understand a word I said. So, I decided to break it down for her. Slow and simple. When rain falls in these mountains, especially near pine trees and old roofs, it picks up minerals and compounds that make it acidic. It's not dangerous if you use it for the right things. Cleaning tools, stripping rust, washing off grime. But pour that into raw steel tanks. Well, let's just say the tanks don't last long. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish. You mean you keep corrosive water in thospirals? It's not corrosive by itself, I explained. But when you let that water sit in contact with unprotected metal, the reaction eats away at the surface. That's why I use heavy plastic barrels and not steel ones. You know, the kind you stole? She turned, beet red, but I wasn't done. If you had asked me, I might have told you what was in them. But instead, you thought you could just take what isn't yours. That's on you." Karen stomped her foot like a child. "I'm calling the HOA. This is an environmental hazard." I almost laughed right there. "HOA Karen, this land isn't part of your fake little HOA meetings?" I checked the deeds years ago. The HOA solved when the last president moved out. "You've been running a ghost club all by yourself." The look on her face was priceless. She stammered for a second, then turned and stormed off. Booty could tell this wasn't over. People like Karen never back down, and they just find another angle. Over the next few days, I kept an eye on her. I'd be out splitting firewood or working on my porch, and I'd catch glimpses of her pacing her yard with her phone, probably Googling how to sue your neighbor. She even had a couple of strangers come by, guys with clipboards and polo shirts who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. I guessed she called in some so-called inspectors to verify my barrels were illegal. One of them approached me while I was fixing a hinge on the gate. "Sir, we're here to check on some reports of improper water storage," he said, sounding half confused. I smiled. "On whose authority?" The HOA." He answered. I handed him a copy of the land survey and HOA dissolution papers I kept in my workshop for moments like this. "Nice try, but there's no HOA jurisdiction. You're standing on private property. Unless you have a court order, I suggest you step off my land." The Gim mumbled something and left without much of a fight. What Karen didn't realize is that I knew my land and my rights better than she knew her own reflection. She could call whoever she wanted. I had documentation to shut them all down. Booty wasn't just going to sit back. No, I wanted Karen to learn a lesson she wouldn't forget. That's when I decided to collect even more of the acidic runoff, filling up 2 extra barrels just for maintenance purposes. I wanted her to see loud and clear that I wasn't going to stop collecting rainwater just because she had a grudge. Every time it rained, I made a show of checking my barrels, tightening the lids, and even labeling them tool cleaning water in big black letters. One afternoon, she yelled from her yard, "You're just rubbing it in now, aren't you?" I smiled, leaning on Miss Hovel. "No, Karen. I'm just minding my business. Maybe you should try it summertime." I could almost hear her grinding her teeth from across the fence. A week later, the situation with her tanks went from bad to worse. The acidic water had eaten through a few seams, and now her precious silver tanks were leaking like a busted fire hydrant. I heard her cussing and kicking at them early one morning, and I'll admit, I took my sweet time walking out to my porch just to watch. She glared at Melagai, was the devil himself. "You'll pay for this," she snarled. Funny, I said last I checked. The thief pays for what they steal, not the other way around. Her face flushed crimson, but she had no comeback. She turned on her heel and marched back to her house, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. I knew what was coming next. Karen was going to escalate, and if she wanted a fight, I was more than ready. The morning her tanks finally gave out is burned into my memory like a scene from a movie. It wasn't just after sunrise when I heard the unmistakable sound of metal splitting. At first I thought it was a fallen tree branch, or maybe the old fence gate creaking. But then I heard her scream. Not just any scream, it wastes kind of wild, panicked shriek that makes the birds scatter out of the trees. I walked onto my porch, coffee mug in hand, and saw water shooting out of Karen's yard like a geyser. Her 2 gleaming silver tanks, the ones she'd been bragging about for weeks, were buckling under the pressure. Rusty brown streaks ran down their sides, and water gushed through jagged holes like someone had taken a shotgun to them. She was running around in her robe, frantically trying to jam towels into the leaks. It was hopeless. I leaned on the porch railing, sipping my coffee, and called out, "Need a hand, Karen?" She froze, her hair sticking out in all directions, and glared at me like I'd caused an earthquake. "This is your fault," she shouted, pointing at me with a soaked towel. "Your toxic water destroyed my tanks." I raised an eyebrow. "My toxic water. That's an interesting way to describe something you stole. You tricked me. You knew I'd used that water." She yelled, her voice cracking. I shook my head. "Still calm, Karen. I didn't trick you. I didn't ask you to take my barrels. You did that all on your own." What you're dealing with right now, that's called karma. She stomped her foot in Thepidal, splashing herself even more. This isn't over. I'm taking this to the HOA board. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. The HOA board. Karen, you are the board. You're the only member of your imaginary little club. Her face went red. And for a moment I thought she might actually throw the towel at me. Instead, she let out a frustrated grunt and stomped back into her house, leaving the water to spray across her perfect yard. For the rest, off morning, I watched the chaos unfold from my porch. Her pristine driveway was a river of muddy water, carrying bits of gravel and leaves down toward the road by midday. Her tanks had completely drained, leaving behind to rust. Hollow shells that looked like they'd been through a war zone. Later, I saw a plumber's truck pull up. A young guy with a toolbox walked around the yard, shaking his head as Karen frantically gestured at the wreckage. I couldn't hear their conversation, but the look on his face said it all. Those tanks were done for. I'll admit there was a part of him that wanted to rub it in. To remind her that if she just minded her own business, none of this would have happened. But I also knew people like Karen don't learn through reasoning. They only learn when they hit a wall, and just crashed into one. That afternoon, I went down to check my own rain barrels. They were still lined up neatly, untouched, catching the light drizzle that had rolled in. As I tightened the lid on one of them, I caught Karen watching me from her window. Our eyes met, and I gave her a little nod, half smirk, half warning. 2 days later, I found a note in my mailbox. This time, it wasn't her usual bossy tone. It was short, almost desperate. We need to talk. This has gone too far, Karen. I crumpled it up and tossed it into the fire pit. I wasn't interested in talking. Not yet. She hadn't even apologized for stealing my barrels. And until she did, she was just another neighbor who thought the rules didn't apply to her. That night I sat on my porch with a glass of whiskey, listening to the crickets. The mountain air was cool, and the moonlight reflected off the puddles in Karen's yard. For the first time in weeks, I felt at peace. She'd learned the hard way that crossing me wasn't going to end well. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the last I'd hear from her. Karen wasn't the kind of person to admit defeat, and when she came back swinging, I'd be ready. 3 days after her tanks turned into rusted wreckage, Karen came back with a vengeance. I was out by the woodpile stacking logs. When I heard tires crunching on gravel, a convoy of 3 SUVs rolled up. Parking right in front off my gate like they were about to stage an intervention, out stepped Karen, wearing her signature pastel cardigan, flanked by 2 men I'd never seen before. Both carried clipboards and had that stiff, bureaucratic look that screams, "I'm here to ruin your day." She marched forward like she was leading a parade. "We need to have a meeting now," she announced, her voice cutting through the quiet mountain air. I wiped the sweat off my forehead and leaned on my axe. "Meeting about what? I'm not on your board." "Karen, I don't even recognize your so-called HOA." One of the clipboard guys cleared his throat. "Sir, we're here on behalf of the Homeowners Association to address some violations." I laughed long and hard. Violations? Are you serious? Did Karen tell you this land is part of her imaginary kingdom? Because it's not. Karen's face twisted with irritation. "Don't play dumb. Those barrels of yours are a hazard. We have photos, complaints, and witnesses. You're going to remove them or face fines." I straightened up, walking toward Thiefens with deliberate slowness. "Photos, complaints. Lady, the only complaint around here is you and those barrels. They were on my property. You want talk about hazards? Maybe ask yourself why you trespassed and stole them." The clipboard guy shifted uncomfortably. "Is that true? Were the barrels removed without permission?" Karen shot him a glare. "That's irrelevant. They were violating HOA guidelines." I could feel my patience slipping. I turned on my heel, went into the cabin, and came back with a folder I'd kept ready for this very moment. Inside were copies of the original land deeds, maps, and legal paperwork showing that my property was never bound by HOA regulations. I slapped the folder against the fence. "See this?" I said, pointing at the highlighted section. The HOA was dissolved in 2007. No one here, including you, has any authority over my land. So take your fake fines and your fake rules and march right back down Corroded. The men with clipboards leaned in to read the papers. One of them nodded. She's right, he said to Karen quietly. If the HOA was dissolved, we don't have jurisdiction here. Karen's face went pale, but she wasn't done. Well, dissolved or not, I still have a right to maintain community standards, and this man's barrels are stolen. I cut in sharply. They were stolen, Karen, and you used them to ruin your own tanks. You owe me an apology, not a lecture. For a moment, there was silence. The men looked between us like referees at a boxing match. Finally, one of them muttered, "Ma'am, I think we're done here," and started walking back to his SUV. Karen's lips quivered, but all Shaman edged was, "This isn't over." She turned and stormed off, heels clicking in the gravel as if she could stomp the earth into submission. Later that evening, I decided to set the record straight once and for all. I printed out a series of photos from my security cameras, clear images of Karen dragging my barrels across the property line. I sent copies to the locale sheriff's office, along with a written statement of trespassing and theft. I wasn't aiming to get her arrested, but E wanted her to know I was serious. The next day, I saw the sheriff's truck parked outside her house. I stood on my perch, arms crossed, watching as she argued with the deputy for a good 15 minutes. By the time he left, she looked like someone had popped her balloon. That night, I got a knock at my door. It was Karen, for the first time since Sesht moved in. She looked human. Her face was tired, her voice quieter than he'd ever heard it. "Look," she said, "maybe we got off on the wrong foot. I thought I was helping the neighborhood, but maybe I went too far." I leaned against the doorframe. "You think?" She winced. "I'll replace your barrels, Andil. Cover the cost of the damage to my own tanks. Let's just call it even." I didn't answer right away. I wanted her to sweat a little. Then I nodded slowly. "Replace my barrels. Stay off my property and we won't have a problem." She nodded, muttering a quick fine before heading back down the road. I knew better than to think Karen was done stirring trouble. People like her always come back for round two. But for now, the score was even, and I had no intention of letting her win the next round. After that tense truce with Karen, I thought I might get a week or two of peace. But of course, Karen couldn't help herself. A few days later, I received a letter not from her, but from some lawyer she had apparently hired. It was full of legal jargon about negligence, unsafe property practice, and damages caused by contaminated water. I laughed so hard he almost spilled my coffee on the letter. Did she really think she could sue me for her own stupidity? She'd stolen my barrels, filled her tanks with acidic runoff, and now wanted to pin the blamey on me. Oh, she was out of her mind. Instead of getting angry, I decided to hit back in a way she wouldn't see coming. I called my buddy Dean, a retired attorney who spent 30 years dealing with property disputes. Dean came over the next afternoon, reviewed all my paperwork, and smirked. "Shadow Scent, have a leg to stand on," he said. "In fact, you've got grounds for a counterclaim trespassing, theft, harassment. If you want to, we can file and make this very uncomfortable for her." I nodded. "Do it. I'm tired of her thinking she can bully me." A week later, Karen was the one getting a legal notice. Dean drafted a clean, airtight complaint that detailed every instance of her trespassing, complete with photos from my security cameras. We also included the harassment letters, the fake HOA demands, and her unauthorized edramol of my property. I didn't ask for a huge payout, just enough to cover the damage she'd done to my barrels and the hassle she caused me. The day she got the notice, I saw her storming around her yard like a caged animal. She called me every name in the book over the fence, but I didn't even look up. I just kept splitting wood, the crack of my axe droning out her ranting. 2 weeks later, we had a mediation meeting at the county courthouse. Karen showed up dressed like she was attending a church lunch and pearl necklace, pastel blazer, the works. She brought her lawyer, a young guy who looked like he regretted taking the case. Dean, calm and collected, laid out our evidence in neat stacks. When the mediator asked for Karen's side, she launched into a dramatic speech about protecting community standards and toxic water. Endangering public health? Dean let her talk, then pushed the photos of her dragging my barrels across the property line across the table. Did you or did you not remove this man's property without permission? The mediator asked. Karen's lawyer leaned in, whispering something that made her face go pale. She stammered, I was just enforcing the HOA rules. Dean smiled like a wolf. The HOA was dissolved years ago. We have theta-solution documents as well as the property deed showing my client's full ownership and rights. She had no legal authority to touch anything on his land. The mediator nodded, turning back to Karen. Ma'am, unless you can provide evidence of an active HOA or any valid ordinance that permits your actions, I strongly advise you to settle. By the end of the session, Karen agreed to pay for my damaged barrels and signed a written statement promising never to interfere with my property again. Ecutel had burned her pride, but she had no choice. When I walked out of that courthouse, the air felt lighter. Dean clapped me on the back. You handled that well, he said. Feels good to finally shut her down, I replied. But something tells me she's not going to give up that easily. Dean laughed. Then we'll be ready for round 2 if there's one. Back at the cabin, I installed a new set of heavy-duty rain barrels. This time chaining them to concrete anchors just in case Karen decided to get any bright ideas. I even put up a motion-activated camera pointed straight at the collection area. If she so much as sneezed near my fence, I'd know. For a first time in months, I slept without worrying about what she might do next. And as I sat on my porch the next morning, sipping coffee while the sun rose over the mountains, I couldn't help but smile. Justice felt good. The days after the courthouse meeting were oddly quiet. For the first time since Karen had moved in, I could step outside without feeling her watchful eyes burning into me. No more notes taped to my gate, no fake whole letters in my mailbox, and no constant nagging about community standards. It was as if the mountains themselves had taken a deep breath and settled back into their natural calm. One morning, I noticed Karen's yard looking unusually bare. Her corroded silver tanks had been hauled off, leaving only dark, muddy patches where they used to stand. The once perfect white stones she'd lined up along her walkway were scattered and dirty. Washed out by the water disaster she'd caused herself, I wondered if she had finally realized that this place wasn't meant for controlling people. It was meant for living freely. Still, I wasn't about to let my guard down. I added a new wooden gate to my driveway secured with a heavy-duty lock and posted a simple sign. Private property, no trespassing. Not because I was afraid of Karen, but because I wanted it crystal clear. No one crosses my line again. About a week later, I was chopping wood when Karen walked by on the road. She didn't look like the queen of the Hoynamore. Her usual pastel outfit was swapped for plain jeans and a fade sweatshirt. She slowed down as she approached the fence, her steps hesitant. Hey, she called softly, almost like she wasn't sure I'd respond. I set down the axe and looked at her. Karen. She shifted her weight, hands in her pockets. I wanted to say I was wrong about all of it. The HOA stuff, the barrels, everything. I thought I was keeping order, but I guess I was just making enemies. I studied her for a moment, trying to gauge if this was another one of her tricks. But for the first time, I saw no arrogance, no fire, just exhaustion. I appreciate you saying that, I said finally. But understand this. If you just left me alone from the start, we wouldn't have gone through all this mess. She nodded, her eyes dropping to the ground. I know. I'll keep my distance. I just wanted to make it right. Then make it right by leaving me to live in peace, I said firmly. She nodded again and walked off without another word. As the weeks passed, the tension faded like snow melting under the spring sun. I spent my days working on small projects, building a new bench for the porch, repairing the old shed roof, and even setting up a better rain collection system with filters and sealed plastic tanks. This time, no one was going to touch my property without consequences. One evening, as I watched the sunset paint the mountains in shades of orange and pink, I felt a sense of satisfaction that I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just about winning against Karen. It was about standing up for what's right. It's about showing that no self-appointed enforcer could take away the simple life I'd built here. I poured myself a glass of whiskey and sat on the porch steps, listening to the wind rustling through the pines. The mountains were quiet again. The stars began to appear one by one, like tiny lanterns in the sky. I thought back to my father's words, "A man's peace is worth fighting for." He was right. I'd fought and I'd won not just for my property, but for the principle that no one, not even someone like Karen, had the right to bully me out of my own life. If there's one thing I've learned from this ordeal, it's that people like Karen thrive on fear and compliance. The moment you stand your ground, they realize their power is just smoke and mirrors. So, to anyone out there dealing with a Karen of their own, don't let them dictate your life. Thanks for sticking with me through this story. If you enjoyed hearing how I handled this chaos, I'd love to know your thoughts. Let us know where you're watching from today. And if you're new here, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Join our growing community.